most of us understand this, that we keep our microphones on mute so that we can hear from our speakers. So we appreciate you doing that. Already lots of people have been using the chat, so that's kind of where we will connect with one another. So please, that's amazing. You can say who you are and where you're joining in from. So please use the chat. And then also during the actual webinar, feel free to ask questions using the chat. We'll try to get to all of them, or at least some of them by the end. And then also, as in any space, this is important that we do not use discriminatory language and we respect one another in this space today. So please be aware that that's really important to all of us. And with those ground rules, I hope everyone can follow them. Then we'll have a great session today. And then we are also delighted to begin with a brief message from Mr. Satoshi Ashidate, as Ben said, President of the Japan Sport Council. So I'll hand it over to him for his opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone at GMT. Here in Tokyo, good evening. I'm Satoshi Ashidate, the President of Japan Sport Council. All colleagues and participants here, I warmly welcome you to this Guidebook launch event, Bridging the Divide in Sport and Sustainable Development. I'm so delighted to be with you today and to declare that the Japan Sport Council and the International Platform on Sport and Development have finally completed the development of this guidebook over a period of 4 years. We are ready to share it with you all. I suppose there are few people who deny that sport can be a driving force to foster mutual understanding, promote healthy lifestyles, empower youth, women, and vulnerable groups, such as persons with disabilities, and eliminate various barriers linked to geography, age, gender, religion, culture, ethnicity, and language. What matters is how we should use sport as a tool for sustainable development, how we should align our activities to international policies and frameworks, including the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and how we should properly monitor and evaluate the changes sport-based activities have created. I hope that our guidebook will give a solution for those issues to the people within and beyond the sports sector who use sport trying to achieve a wide range of outcomes. I firmly believe that the guidebook will literally bridge the divide between policy and practice, between theory and reality. The partnership with Sport and Deaf and the Swiss Academy for Development enabled us to carry out a long journey to complete this practical and comprehensive guidebook. So I'd like to thank Mr. Conor Splen, Executive Director of the Swiss Academy for Development, and colleagues there for tremendous effort so far. I'm also grateful to the advisory committee members, the representatives from UNESCO, IOC, Laurel Sport for Good Foundation, and Agitus Foundation, who kindly provided strategic and technical advice. The Japan Sport Council is proud that through the creation of Guidebook, both in English and Japanese, we could contribute to international society harnessing the power of sport for sustainable development. I hope that many of you will make use this guidebook in a variety of situations. Thank you very much. どうもありがとうございました。Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ashidate, for those words and also for the entire Japan Sport Council for their leadership and support for this project. As you already said, we will now have some introductory remarks from Mr. Connor Spreng, Executive Director of the Swiss Academy for Development, who have operated Sport and Dev since its inception in 2003. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marissa and Ben, for the introductions and for organizing this webinar. Of course, thank you very much, Mr. Satoshi Ashidate, for your kind words, and even more so for the steadfast support by the Japan Sports Council for such important work, and the guidebook being launched today being a shining example of that. I'd like to offer just a few words of context where I think this guidebook falls within the work that we do at the Swiss Academy for Development. SA4D was started 30 years ago with the idea that in the field of development, the connection between research and practice should be strengthened. Especially over the past 20 years, SA4D focused its work on sport and development. We organized the first international conference on the subject in 2003 here in Macklingen, which was an important event, and the guidebook also highlights that. As has been said already, we have hosted the Sport and Dev platform ever since that first conference. I'd say we haven't always been as effective as we'd like to be in staying true to this founding idea to bridging research and practice. And the reason is that it's really hard to do. And so to me, it's in this context that the guidebook being launched today is especially valuable. It seeks to bridge the gap between, or bridge the divide, to use its phrasing, between policy and practice. But in so doing, I think it offers an important contribution on the state of research in the area of sport and development and how this connects to practice and to programs. So allow me just to highlight a few aspects of where I think this guidebook's contribution is especially noteworthy. One is the importance of being balanced. The book emphasizes the importance of knowing the limits of what we do, the limits of sport and development, and of being open and precise about those limits. I think that's a very valuable and important point. Another is the state of research. As I mentioned, the guidebook provides contribution here by highlighting what we know, but critically what we don't yet know about impact and effectiveness, and also provides an overview of where those gaps exist and why, how they might be bridged in the future. Overall, to me, the guidebook is remarkable because it takes on such an enormous task. It seeks to be relevant and useful to a very broad audience and on a very broad topic. For example, on program management and how to approach programming in this area. It does so by sticking to the basics, which is something I think is especially valuable here and is done often not well enough. And so as we are seeking to continue our contributions in sport and development, I personally, and I'm sure all of us here, find this guidebook to be an inspiration. It really is practical, relevant, And I have no doubt it'll be very useful to practitioners in the field. I don't take inspiration lightly, and so I'm really grateful. So big thanks to Ben and Etsuko for this guidebook, and to all who supported it and all who were involved, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Connor, for these insights, and I also look forward to hearing from the different practitioners who are a part of this and who are using it. So I will now hand it over to my co-host Ben, who will introduce our next presenters.
Thank you very much, Marissa, and thank you, Mr. Ashidate, for your inspiring words and support, and thank you, Connor, as well, for those really valuable insights. I think it's really important that the guidebook does provide a balanced and realistic view of sports. I think we need to be more serious about where sport can and cannot make a difference, and we need to be more critical about the ways in which sport can contribute to development goals in real, measurable ways. And I think the guidebook tries to strive for that balance in the use of sport for sustainable development. Now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Ms. Etsuko Yamada, the head of International Sport for Development at the Japan Sport Council. Etsuko and I started working on this guidebook in 2018, so it's over 4 years now, with many delays and challenges along the way. And we've been supported by many stakeholders, as Mr. Ashidate referenced, many of whom are in the room here today. But without Etsuko, we literally would not have this completed resource of a guidebook here today. Everything from writing the content together with me to designing, proofreading, editing, and ensuring that we have an e-version online by today. So thank you, Etsuko, for all your hard work, long hours, extensive overtime. And over to you to explain more about the guidebook and how people can use it.
Thank you, Van, for your kind introduction. Well, first of all, let me express my gratitude to Sport and Ref and the Swiss Academy for Development for their wonderful cooperation with us. In particular, I cannot thank Ben for his hard work on this project. I also appreciate the valuable support the advisory committee members and the reviewers have provided so far. So now let's watch this short video.
While sport is increasingly used as a tool to enable change beyond the playing field, there remain gaps in understanding and application among policymakers and practitioners as to how sport can best contribute to sustainable development and peace. While 64% of respondents are aware of the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, most are unaware of the Kazan Action Plan, the WHO Global Action Plan on Physical Activity, and the UN Action Plan on Sport for Development and Peace. Only 38% of respondents state that the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda influence their work quite a lot or very much, while the majority feel that the Kazan Action Plan, WHO GAPA, and the UN Action Plan and SDP have nothing or little to do with their work. Respondents cite various challenges to implementing projects that use sport for development, ranging from a lack of budget, resources, and qualified personnel to limited capacity in areas such as monitoring and evaluation. The survey findings indicate that there is a clear need to build capacity to manage policies and projects using sport for development, including in areas such as how to draft a project plan, how to monitor and evaluate the activities, and how to ensure sustainability. The Japan Sport Council and the International Platform on Sport and Development have developed a guidebook to bridge the divide between policy and practice by building capacity to manage policies and programs that use sport for sustainable development. What does the guidebook include? Let us introduce some key elements now. In addition to major global sport policy frameworks, the Guidebook introduces several important concepts that are relevant to sport and development, such as policy coherence and intentionality. The Guidebook provides detailed guidance on how to apply policies and frameworks to programs and projects in the field with clear case studies and exemplars. The Guidebook provides guidance on how to design, implement, and monitor and evaluate sport for development policies and programs, sharing key tools, resources, and examples. Checklists are also provided for relevant areas, ensuring readers can apply these learnings in the real world. Please visit the JSC's website to access the digital guidebook. If you need a hard version copy, please contact the Japan Sport Council. We hope this guidebook helps you to better manage your policy, program, or project that uses sport to contribute to development.
So now I would like to give you an outline of our guidebook. The guidebook is available in English and in Japanese, both in the form of hard version copy and ebook. The digital guidebook is open access and freely available on the JSC website. And it consists of 5 chapters. The chapter 1 provides brief background of why and how this guidebook was developed, who the target audiences are, and what we aim to. The chapter 2 provides an overview of sport for development and peace and its key milestones, as well as global policy frameworks and commitments, including the Sustainable Development Goals, Kazan Action Plan, and WHO GAPA. As indicated in the results of the survey we conducted in 2019, the majority of respondents reflected that these policies or plans do not majorly influence their work. So in chapter 3, we try to explain how these global policies and plans are relevant to the audiences, how to translate these policies into real-life programs and projects by providing guidance on how to apply attributes of sport as a tool, what kind of thematic areas sport could address, which principles for STP programs we need to keep in mind, such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and gender mainstreaming with case studies and examples. Chapter 4 underlines the importance of a systematic evaluation of sport for a development program throughout the life cycle of program, and provides practical guidance on how to design, deliver, measure, and evaluate it, with a lot of diagrams, examples, and checklists like this. And chapter 5 provides broader guidance related to collective impact, partnerships, and advocacy. Some readers might be overwhelmed by the thickness of this guidebook, which has more than 120 pages in total. However, you don't necessarily read everything. Depending on your knowledge, skills, and experiences, you can pick and choose the relevant parts and topics. Please make the most of various functions of ebook. For example, when you want to learn the concept of intentionality of STP programs, you can enter a word in search box. Then it tells you the relevant pages like this. And as this guidebook has been developed based on an extensive literature review, there are a lot of resources referred to in the footnotes. And at the end of each chapter, additional resources are also featured. So you can further learn the related matters by clicking those links. I would also like you to utilize the notes and marks button, where you can take notes with different colors, and highlights button at the bottom, where you can draw another line or draw something freely like this. And from my notes and marks on the left end, you can jump to the relevant page. So it's very useful. Let's take a little bit. So the part I mentioned is here. So you can see the relevant pages and jump to that one. And I'm so happy to share that according to the data so far, 800 people from 98 countries have already used the digital guidebook. So we hope many people will further utilize it in their fields. So that's all about it from my side. Thank you so much. So back to you, Ben.
Great. Thank you, Etsuko, for really, I hope the video and that presentation really helped bring the guidebook to life for everybody. And yeah, really fantastic overview of how it works in its practical application. It is a real ebook, as you can see, and not just a PDF, which Etsuko shared, which has far greater functionality, enabling you to track your progress, take notes, fill out self-assessment sheets, search for keywords or terms. And yeah, we encourage you to share this widely with your networks. And as has already been communicated, the resource is free of charge and available on the Japan Sport Council website. Over 800 people, as Etsuko said, have already accessed this. It's available in English and in Japanese. And if anybody has further resources to make this available in other languages, such as French, Spanish, Arabic, please do contact us, because we do recognize that language is a limiting factor. And we were only able to raise resources to make this book available in English and Japanese. But already we have received excellent feedback on the guidebook. And hope it is a useful resource for everybody, from practitioners to policymakers. It is certainly not just limited to the SDP or sport for development and peace field, but we see it as broadly relevant to the broader sports sector, sports officers and people working in the sport instructors, as well as the international development and humanitarian sector, who may use sport to contribute to their goals, whether those be health, education, gender equity, etc. So we will now move, and yeah, I see some people are having problems with the sound. I think it's coming clearly through for most people. So if you are having problem with the sound, perhaps you can change your sound settings, because I do think that most people are able to hear us clearly, I hope. We will now move into a panel discussion. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers, some of whom were very involved in the process of co-creating and reviewing this guidebook. So I'm delighted to have here with us today Dr. Lynn Sambili, who's project manager for sport development and peace at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Mr. Suhil Tandon, who's the director and founder of Pro Sport Development based in India. Dr. Morten Schmidt, global director of programs and grants at the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation, calling in from London. And Ms. Talia Kaufman, associate at the International Institute for Child Rights and Development, who also used to work in sport for development at Skatistan and is dialing in very early from the East Coast of the United States of America. So thank you all for joining us today. To the audience, please feel free to type your questions and comments in the chat. I hope we'll have some time for some Q&A at the end of this panel. You can also address a question directly to one of the panelists or to the previous speakers, such as Itsuko, Connor Spreng from SA4D, or Mr. Satoshi Ashidate from the Japan Sport Council. And we'll try and make sure we have time for questions and answers at the end. So my first question, which is to all the panelists, just to kick off, well, what are the challenges? You've all worked extensively in sport for development. What are the challenges you've faced using sport for sustainable development within the roles and the organizations that you've worked at? So we'll kick off with Lynn and Talia, and then move on to Morten and Suhail. So just some brief responses on the challenges you've faced within the roles and organizations you've worked at.
Thanks, Ben. Is it okay to kick off?
Go for it, Lynn.
Brilliant. So in terms of challenges that we faced, there's a number of challenges, but I'll start with saying that number one has been on how do we advocate, the overarching sports policies and strategies from a national to a grassroots sports perspective. It's a challenge because it's so important that we have a common approach in terms of how we collect data and how we share it, because that means that it's more critical. We have a more critical lens through which we are enhancing greater intersectoral collaboration. From the Commonwealth Secretariat's perspective, we are continuously calling for more streamlined measurement, collection of data, and investment in evidence-based sport, physical activity, and physical education policy, because we know that there's a greater, much larger benefit that's amplified from the grassroots level into policy space. And I think that this is one thing that the guidebook has really addressed very clearly in terms of how do we amplify that from the community level all the way through to the policy level. A second challenge is, and we're all privy to this, we've all experienced this, is the COVID-19 challenge. And how do we ensure we are designing effective roadmaps for the safe return to sports post-COVID-19? How are we rebuilding on these efforts that have been made by governments or by practitioners in the field towards ensuring a more resilient sports sector that, ultimately is enhancing the contribution of sports to the SDGs? So from a ComSec perspective, in some ways, we feel quite privileged that we've been uniquely placed to see the effects of the pandemic and how that contributes to the health, social, and economic crisis that exists, but more importantly, how it can address cross-cutting themes and priorities. So the COVID-19 pandemic is a challenge that has been ongoing, but we are now in that recovery mode, and how we can harness our amplified action through resources such as the Guidebook, for example, to ensure that we're reaching young people who may have been marginalized because of the pandemic, increased levels of physical inactivity, incidences of GBV that went up, unfortunately, and even instances of increased weighthood. So there's this linkage between policy and practice and the reality on the ground, and ensuring that people are engaged towards greater, this challenge is addressed. I guess a third challenge could be for us is in terms of collecting clear and disaggregated data and how this then leads to enhancing policy coherence, which is so important because then that means that there's greater investment that is directed towards the sector and addresses, or rather advances, gender equality in sport. I'll close off by just saying that ultimately for us within the Commonwealth Secretariat, we are focused on what we'd call 3 Ps, and addressing this challenge of data is focused on how do we produce policy that's developing people and measuring progress. It's important because we understand that in many Commonwealth countries and in governments, really, sport is housed within sports ministries, but then it's also these mandates are prioritized towards elite sport rather than grassroots sports. And so addressing that disconnect, I'm sure publications such as this will help us reduce that lack of coordination, that duplication of effort, and also just really increase that awareness and understanding of what are the tenets of sport and sport for development and peace. So I'll pause there, Ben, and in the interest of time, and hand over to my next panel member.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Let's hand over to Talia.
Thank you, Lynn. So I will echo a little bit of what Lynn said in my first challenge, that there's a lot of innovation in the sport for development space. So that means there's a lot of passion driving projects, but sometimes programs are just being invented from scratch without a clear evidence base, just because people do want to share their positive experiences that they've had with sports. So this can lead to exciting approaches, but it also poses challenges when it comes to reporting on outcomes from the programs. And I definitely experienced this with Skateistan as the programs director there, with the challenge of showing how skateboarding could work as a positive intervention for children. And related to this, it can also be very hard to quantify the long-term impact of sports for development programs. So capturing and telling the long-term stories of change in a compelling way can be a super huge challenge. And finally, in the reporting space, just demands from funders on reporting can also be very taxing. Each funder has different reporting requirements. So come reporting time, you can have several big reports going out every single quarter, and streamlining the collection of all this data so it doesn't actually interfere with the participant experience is a challenge as well. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Talia. Yeah, really important insights there, and completely concur. Over to you, Morten, and then Suhail.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting us to participate in this launch. First, just so this doesn't become all about challenges and all about things that needs to be addressed in the sector, sport for development is a high octane sector in international development, and this guidebook can mix a little bit of rocket fuel into the combustion as well to speed up and to further qualify the work that we're doing. So it is an amazing sector with amazing commitment, highly innovative and creative ways of working with children, young people, and vulnerable adults. So there's a lot of appreciation that needs to be set up for sport for development as well. That said, I think some of my inputs is a little bit in extension of what Talia said. What we're seeing in the sport for development sector is a lot of commitment linked to delivering sports activities, linked to delivering or working with children and young people in certain way, sports-based ways, and very much basing development impact on assumptions about impact more than hard evidence, knowledge about theory of change, knowledge about delivering programs, knowledge about delivering activities in a consistent and coherent manner. It's very much about sport and delivering sports. And I think one of the big challenges for our sector is to make the link between that type of activities and longer term development, social development for children and young people. I think that's a challenge within the sector, but a lot of evidence is already being developed. There is a growing body of evidence that counters some of these challenges. And I think at a higher level, one of the big challenges that I think we're still facing as a sector is the lack of appreciation of what's actually happening on the ground from the high-level institutions in the UN system, no offense to the UN system, and in COMSEC and in other multilateral agencies and institutions. COMSEC possibly being one of the agencies with a better language and a stronger understanding of the work happening on the ground. But assumptions, more than hard evidence, is one important thing. Linked to this very strong commitment to delivering activities is also the reality that people don't join our sector to set up organizations, to set up governance systems, to set up project management, financial management, fund development, platforms, etc. They join the sector because, as I say, it's a commitment to sport. It's replicating own experiences. But I think the flip side of that is also that we're seeing quite weak organizations from organizations and that it takes quite a lot of work, quite a lot of investment and commitment to the more tedious side of program development, than namely the organizing parts to create more sustainability in the sector. Monitoring and evaluation and evidence, the backside of delivering activities remain a big challenge. And that's an issue that has been raised increasingly over the last few years, including some of the work that we have sponsored as well. the lack of rigorous scientific evidence for the impact of sports-based programs. But I say it is changing. We also need to recognize that now we are at a different place than we were 5 years ago when we invested in the last piece of research. And then just the last one, which is being touched on very briefly in the guidebook, but which does remain quite a significant challenge for the sector. It's all around safeguarding, where we do have now international safeguards for children in sports and sports-based programs, but where we still see safeguarding as very much, in many countries, many subsectors in sport development, safeguarding still seems to be more of a tick box exercise than a practical implication for designing and delivering programs. And I wanted to raise that one because without safeguarding, we need to ask ourselves if we really should be delivering these programs. So some key challenges, but also recognizing that this is an amazingly strong sector and very, very committed sector that we should support in the best way possible. And this is certainly a big contribution towards that goal. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Morten. Yeah, some fantastic insights, and I agree it's important to recognize how far we have come as a sector, and also where we still need to go. Sohail, over to you.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for having me over. Great to join everyone. I'll outline some challenges from a more practitioner's point of view. I mean, for all those working in sport for development and peace and running programs on the ground, one major challenge continues to be that of funding, especially given COVID has impacted a lot of funding and programs on the ground. And this funding in particular, the challenge is having long-term, consistent and reliable funding to implement on-ground for the programming. And that also impacts if we don't have consistent long-term funding, it impacts how we can best measure the impact that the sports-based programs are having. So that's definitely a challenge that many practitioners allude to in the sector. Other than that, from the perspective of working in India, I think there is definitely a lack of awareness and understanding on using sport for development and peace. And this ranges from the government to the education sector, to the sports industry, to the non-profit sector. And I think there is a lack of understanding on how sport can be utilized for social impact. As Lynn mentioned, the focus is on elite sport and sort of grassroots sport, sport participation, and the social impact of sport usually gets left behind. Another challenge that we find is that of human resources, especially in terms of spending a lot of time, energy, and resources in orienting and training our human resources to work in the sector and to work with programs using sport for development and peace. And this ranges from trainers on ground to project officers to management personnel. So I think most on-ground organizations will spend a lot of time in sort of building capacity of their teams. So I think, and one thing, I mean, those are the three key challenges I outlined. And I think one thing I would like to say is that all the three speakers who spoke before me, I think their challenges intersect with the challenges that I have mentioned, and there is a correlation between them. So I think it needs to be looked in the sort of larger context as well.
Great, thanks, Sohail, and everyone for those insights, and yeah, some real common challenges across contexts and cultures, and the way they intersect and reinforce each other. So you guys have touched briefly on this already, but maybe just in a minute or two, just really briefly, how do you think this guidebook in particular can address some of the challenges you've mentioned, and how can it be useful to practitioners and policymakers? So maybe just some brief responses on that. We'll kick off this time with Morten and Sohail, and then move on to Lynn and Talia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I think from our perspective, my perspective, I think Connor already kicked off in his brief introduction one of the big benefits of this document, and that is that it begins to challenge assumptions. it begins to raise questions around the reach and the appropriateness of sports-based interventions. And that we need to ask ourselves a question when sports-based interventions are appropriate and prudent to deliver social change and when they're not. As I said a few minutes ago, one of the big challenges that we're seeing is that there are a lot of assumptions about the effect of sports-based interventions. And I think this one is quite inspiring in the way, the book is quite inspiring in the way that it challenges us to ask these questions about when we should be using sport-based approaches for development. So I think that's an important one. It's important that it raises the issue around adapting sports-based approaches to the social purpose that they want to achieve. Because what we are seeing in the sector is descriptions of interventions at a grassroots level and high-level reflections on which SDGs we're contributing to, but making that connect, adapting, and trying to understand the change that is being generated through these programs and how they feed into the Sustainable Development Goals. I think one of the interesting things about this book. And then I think it gives us a little bit of a context, a global policy context, which I think contributes to creating a shared language in the sector, and a language with which we can speak not only with each other, with our peers, but also vertically in the sports sector ecosystem, and link stronger into global policies, which is the global language for the sector and for wider international development. And then finally, just to keep it brief, in a very, very practical sense, especially when you come towards the end of the program, it gives very, very practical guidance on how to put together a sports development program. It tells you, or it gives you instruction and inspiration and even tools. I know it's not a cool toolkit, I know you're calling it a guidebook, but there are real tools with real questions for self-assessment that you can use in the book when you want to develop a theory of change, when you want to develop your governance, when you want to develop the entire program design for an intervention, which can be extremely helpful, especially for us sportsmen who are not necessarily particularly well equipped for reflecting more systematically about the work that we are doing, but just love delivering activities to young people and see how those activities can help change the course of their lives, empowering and putting young people on different social mobility trajectories. Thank you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Morten. Some great insights again. Sohail, from your perspective?
I think the guidebook will be very important in generating awareness and educating various types of stakeholders on how sport can be used for social change. I think that has been missing, especially in the context of India, where we primarily work. Other than that, I think it'll be a great tool to advocate for the sport for development and peace sector, and how it can be engaged, how the sector can engage with other industries and other sectors. And finally, from a practitioner's lens, I think, as Morten said, you call it a guidebook. I mean, I see it as a great training manual, which can be used by different types of people working in the sector to build their knowledge and to connect the guidebook with what they're doing on ground. So I think it can be a great training tool as well.
Great, thanks, Sohail. Yeah, and we are very open. I mean, we've called it a guidebook, but we understand people are going to use this in different ways. Some people may use certain parts of the guidebook. Some people may use it as training manuals, and universities may use it. And we've got interest from universities using it for some of their students, governments, using it for policy officers to translate policy into practice. So, could be used as a guidebook, a manual, a toolkit, and we're very open to the myriad ways in which it can be used. And as someone's raised, obviously we understand it needs to be adapted to context. There's no one size fits all. It's a guidebook, and we encourage people to adapt it and use it in the way that is most suitable to their context and challenges. Great. Lynn and then Talia.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. I'll chime in with a few more comments to that and frame maybe my response from global, regional, national, and communal level, and how this guidebook really has worked hard to address these challenges that we've all raised, and as Morten said, also raised up some opportunities in there. I think from a personal perspective first, this guidebook, the way it's been written has allowed for a lot of reflexivity, a lot of reflection. So for me, I see that it's provided bite-sized chunks of information, so you can take what you need from it, but also very cleverly and very helpfully, it's avoided blanket responses and actions on how you can apply this to your context, but really has allowed, and hopefully will continue to allow practitioners, when you pick this up, to say, okay, I'll take a step back and say, how does this apply in my context? And that's really, insightful and encouraging, because it will then lead to greater ownership of this document. It will lead to greater ownership and greater responses, and hopefully that will even trickle into how data is measured and presented. So globally, really, if I was looking at it globally, this guidebook will support different practitioners and policymakers to fully understand and appreciate how sport can drive positive and sustainable outcomes in their sectors, be that health, education, social welfare, across the board. It will help that. Regionally and nationally, and speaking from a Commonwealth Secretariat perspective, this guidebook will serve as a tangible, accessible resource, and it will increase the capacity of senior sports officials, health officials, and ensure that continuity of action moves from the institutional level and goes into the local levels. That local exchange of knowledge, it's provided that bridge, that very clear connection to what are you doing at the institutional level, and how can I apply that communally. And then when it comes to the community level, this guidebook, I see it as supporting the local footprint of SDP, what that really means in the varying contexts that we all operate in. I like to see it, as I said earlier, as a digestible, bite-sized approach can be applied here. So a coach can pick this up and use the checklists that are very helpful, or the pitfalls that are highlighted as top tips, so that everyone can really consider how do they create a space that is, respectful, but also honors how we want to collect data, how we want to amplify that and then feed it back. So really, really well done. That's how I see it addressing these challenges. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Lynn. And over to Talia.
Thank you, Lynn. So Morten alluded somewhat to the importance of a theory of change to back the sport for development programs. And the guidebook has some substantial comments on theory of change and where to begin. So in section 4.5, assessment of program theory, and 5.3, building capacity in practice and policy, this is touched on. I definitely benefited from doing that process with the team at Skateistan, and it helped us understand how the program was actually working in the long term through the youth leadership volunteer program. And it told us, by doing that process, that we had to really focus more on tracking those participants who were there for the long term. We also undertook that process with an action sports consortium, and that showed us that the change was happening through the coached participant relationship. So doing a TOC can definitely give you clues to how the program is really working. On page 70, there's examples of changes and outcomes that you can draw on for your program design. And page 79 also looks at theory failure, so possible reasons the program might not be working the way you expected. In terms of addressing the burden of reporting, I think the antidote is advocating with funders for participatory evaluation and qualitative evaluation methods like photos, art, stories of growth, testimonials, and there's lots of examples from pages 97 to 101 on outcomes and data sources. So building this data collection into the program structure, for example, making a game out of a survey or using coach observations or journals as sources of data. can help make sure that programs can continue without too much distraction. As well, feeding these findings back to participants is so important. So this is covered a bit in section 4.7, learning from the monitoring and evaluation process. And there's a checklist on page 94 for good monitoring and evaluation practices. So yeah, I would just say try not to get stuck in the trap of like proving that sport is good for participants. Use the information here to contextualize sport and focus on your unique edge with funders. So what specific changes are you looking for as a result of your unique program? And section 2 and 3.2 have a lot of good foundational information that can back up the program theory. Thanks.
Great, thanks everybody. I am going to just ask, just in terms of time, I want to make sure we have time for questions because I see some really good questions coming through already. So I'm just going to ask the panelists to keep the next few answers quite short if they can, just so we make sure we still have time for the audience to ask questions and engage. So just very quickly, Sohail and Talia, you were both involved in reviewing this guidebook at various stages. So how did you find that experience, just very briefly, and how do you feel about the final product? So Sohail and then Talia.
Great experience. I think the final product is very apt for various stakeholders. I think the content in the handbook is logically laid out. It's simple to read. It's not jargonistic in nature. As Connor mentioned, it also spells it out as it is. There is no misconceptions of what sport can do, but it keeps it very realistic. And also I was reviewing it from a practitioner's point of view, and I felt that the content was very apt. I have already given it to a few of my colleagues to go through and then link it to their work. So I thought that at least from a practitioner's point of view, it was very apt.
I'll just make some brief comments. I also appreciated the level of detail included in the review process, and to have the paper version in a couple of different formats was really helpful. So I think there was obviously care in terms of how usable this would really be, and it's clear that paid off because you have a very practical resource, not just in content, but also just in terms of how it's laid out and how interactive the manual, the guidebook actually is. So the final product is very clear and very pretty, and it's pleasant to use. I just wish I'd had it at earlier stages in my sport for dev career. So thanks.
Thanks, Talia. Lynn, you've touched on this a little bit already. I mean, you work extensively with governments across the Commonwealth and in mainstreaming sport and development. So just briefly, how do you see the guidebook playing a role within the public sector?
Thanks, Ben. So it's a really good question. In terms of how I see it, I'll just frame it in the sense that a while ago, the Commonwealth Secretariat had our evaluation of our SDP Technical Assistance Program reviewed, and some of the emerging findings from that in focus were that a key barrier to a successful implementation of SDP policy is that lack of qualified resource with the right skills and training within government ministries. And what that meant is that mobilization of new policy frameworks were often delayed or halted altogether. Another key challenge, so what that has informed us and how I see this guidebook playing that clear role, is that it spoke to how we need to ensure our commitment to accessible, regular training and capacity building is front and center. And so I see that from a Secretariat's perspective, we recognize the need for greater mainstreaming of sport as an enabler for inclusive, resilient, and sustainable development. In terms of the public sector, it can and shall be used to understand policy in relation to programs and projects, and that's the sweet spot where this guidebook has offered that kind of guidance, and that cyclical process of measurement, of ensuring the right skills and training is taking place towards greater mobilization of policy frameworks. So it's clear for me. I just see that the guidebook has addressed that challenge, and will definitely be a resource that is pinpointed to and embedded within the work that we do. As we've now just gotten into a new strategic plan, this is something that we would very easily see how we can feed it in.
Very good.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you.
Morton, over to you. You represent the Laureate Sport for Good Foundation. You work across the globe. Last year alone, your efforts with partners reached over 250,000 people directly and many more indirectly. How do you see the Guidebook supporting some of your efforts as the foundation?
I think internally and externally, we're probably going to use the Guidebook. I can easily see the whole Guidebook, or part of the Guidebook at least, become mandatory reading for new Laureate staff, foundation staff, because it does give context, it does give kind of a good overarching understanding of what sport development is and how the sector has evolved over the years and what you would be looking for in programs, trying to establish themselves as sport development programs. So I think as a preparatory exercise, I think it's really good for people wanting to work in this space, and certainly for people who want to work with someone like Sport for Good. Externally, it's important to understand what it is we're doing. One of our mission work stream is to support sport development organizations across the world, and we do that through funding and we do it through technical assistance. And some of the things that I mentioned before in some of the interventions around challenging assumptions about trying to get organized around how to develop a project, how to develop a program, how to dig into evidence, project or program interventions, how to begin setting up prudent and appropriate safeguarding measures. All of these things. Well, there are organizations, a lot of organizations in the sport for development space who are already doing all of this stuff really, really good. Skatestand, among other thanks to Talia's many efforts, has turned into one of these extremely strong organizations internationally, and there are many more. But the vast undergrowth of new emerging initiatives, again, driven by people who are completely committed to trying to replicate their own experiences into these kind of activities. Not really understanding sport for development, not really understanding the context, not necessarily having a good idea of how to put together a viable intervention. We can easily see a toolkit like this or a guide like this be used in that direct bilateral relationship between us and many of these smaller grassroots organizations we're working with, because it does give some very, very good recommendations to these organizations.
Great, thanks, Morton. Sohail, over to you. I mean, how do you feel this guidebook is relevant to organizations like yours operating in India and the region? In 1 minute, if you can. Thank you.
Sure, I'll keep it brief. I think relevant not just for organizations like PSD, but also the largest stakeholders in the sport for development and peace ecosystem. I think for organizations like us, it's a great resource to further build our knowledge and link it to the work we do on the ground. And I think from a practitioner's perspective, sometimes working on the ground, we lose sight of how our work is feeding into more global frameworks and policies. So I think the guidebook will help us to link our work with the larger frameworks. And I think for the ecosystem, again, generating awareness, generating knowledge for various stakeholders, that will be key, not just for the sake of generating awareness, but also to enable stakeholders in the sector to come together, work together in order to create a larger impact through sport. So I think that's sort of how I see it.
Great, thanks, Sohail. Talia, you've mentioned safeguarding, you mentioned a few times here already, and I know you have extensive experience in child rights and protection. So how can the guidebook support actors that are working in this space?
Thank you. So I think just by mentioning safeguarding a few times throughout the guidebook, it really puts it out there that this is not a negotiable or a nice to have, but it really has to be looked after in the program design, both to manage the risks to participants and to manage risks to the organization and the sector's reputation. So let me make this as quick as possible. It shouldn't be a box ticking exercise, as Morten pointed out. Section 3.4 speaks to the foundational principles of do no harm and integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion into hiring practices and recruitment of participants. So integrating these ideas into the safeguarding to make sure that the program is being operated in a really fair way is important. And on page 57, there's a checklist that includes questions like, have we moved beyond mere inclusion and actually engage the actors in decision making? Or also, is there bias in the selection of program participants? And that's addressed a little bit later on in the guidebook. So just as further resources in this space, I would recommend Beyond the Binary, which is a paper on, or a resource rather, on including non-binary individuals in sports for dev programs, which ties in importantly with protection and safeguarding, and goodpush.org's library. I'll put the link in the chat, but it's a great source of templates and training for protection, safeguarding, as well as reporting on incidents. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Lynn, just quickly over to you. I mean, we know the Commonwealth Games has just happened in Birmingham. So very briefly, I mean, how do you think this guidebook can support stakeholders involved in the organization of sporting events?
So I'll try and be brief then. So first, just to quickly say, the Commonwealth Games, Birmingham Games really, were the first global sport event to award more medals to women than men, and also were really framed as the games for everyone. So how it can build on that is very clearly can serve as a mechanism, the guidebook plus the games, but can serve as a mechanism to ensure greater coherence in policy to achieve the SDGs, especially in areas of environmental sustainability, disability inclusion, as Talia has mentioned, and gender mainstreaming in sports. So I would say that the guidebook can support stakeholders across all tiers of society and the sector, the SDP sector. So at the communal level, it can be used to address these very same goals of environmental sustainability, disability inclusion, gender mainstreaming, via how are we rolling out programs, and that's linked to the legacy of the games, that local footprint of the games. At the institutional level, it's now again keeping that chain of communication clear and ensuring that that is reflected in how policy is written and how it's understood. All the documents are there. It's really using this resource to ensure that there is effective monitoring and effective and concerted efforts, so that we're not working in silos, but rather that we're working together towards ensuring clear, measurable, and balanced use of sport for sustainable development. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more I could say, but thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks. And we could go on with all of these questions. So thanks, Lynn. Final question, which is just as we close up this panel. Morten, from your side, is there anything you would like to add before we close up here and move into the Q&A?
I'd recommend everyone to open the document and read through it. It doesn't take long, and it is extremely well organized and it's a good information, particularly for organizations who are beginning to dabble into the sport development space. But I would say also for international organizations who might not fully appreciate yet the potential and the power of sport for social development.
Great. Thank you very much to our panelists for all your unique insights and for really engaging discussion. I'll now hand over quickly to Marissa, who will facilitate a short Q&A with our presenters.
Thank you. So I'll jump right into it. I'll go to you, Suhail. So a question around with an intercultural perspective and thinking about intercultural context, how have you adopted or the guidebook for different cultures, countries and conditions in which you're working with? So do you have any examples? So specific, yeah, they really want to understand, as Ben said, it's a guidebook so people can adopt it, but do you have any kind of examples where you have been able to adopt it to your situation?
So I think as it is a guidebook, I think seeing how it can be relevant in our context is key. And I think we've been doing that at more of an individual level. So for example, I've given the guidebook to a few of my colleagues. So they have experience in, say, program management, in an M&E, in delivering programs on ground. And we've left it to them in terms of seeing how best the guidebook can help them. We hope to do this at a more organizational level as well. But right now we've kept it to an individual level, because I think it's important also to learn the other way around. Once you have done things on the ground, and then sort of going back to a resource like this and seeing what have they been doing that has been successful and what then they can change. Because we've just recently done that, we hope to then come together as a group and discuss, what we can change. But I think, for example, from a program management perspective and from an M&E perspective, there are lots of good insights that we can take, and because we try to be an organization where everyone has their voice in terms of doing things and putting ideas into practice. I think it'll also be left individually for them to see how the guidebook can best support their development as well as the development of the organization and its programs.
Thank you. I'll move on to Lynn. And actually, Lynn, I would suggest you look at the chat. There's quite a lot of questions directed your way, but I'll ask you this one specifically. How to bridge the divide between organized sports, so national, international governing bodies, and the sector of sport for development. Do you have any insights you can share there?
How to bridge the divide between, could you just repeat that part?
Yes,
Okay.
how to bridge the divide between organized sports, so the national and international governing bodies, and the sector of sport for development.
Oh, nice. That's a really good question. So how to bridge that divide is to have more, take a step back first and see who's not at the table, number one. As I said earlier, we do a lot of good work, but in silos. There's a lot of excellent work that's being done at the community level that feeds directly into what is happening within federations, for example, but there isn't that connection. Is it possible? Yes, perhaps through organized, I'll try and answer this from a practitioner's perspective, have organized trainings and workshops that address all that, increase knowledge and awareness on what SDP is and how this, informs your knowledge and practice. And also to help break those silos. From a policy perspective, have more health ministries and education and sports ministries working together and increasing those training programs as well. At a very, very granular level, maybe have more sports for development and peace, and have more roundtable discussions around or beyond the field of play, really. So have a match, but then beyond the match, have those conversations happening. And that will give you a chance to see who's not at the table. How do we work towards more equitable resource sharing, having more voices at the table? So that's how I would attempt to answer that question. I'll give it more thought. Happy to email the respondent as well or share that later.
Thank you, Lynn. I will now move to Morten. There was a suggestion in the chat that there could also be a need to educate philanthropists and the funding agencies on sport for development work and the nature of its impact. And there was even a suggestion for a guidebook for funders around sport for development. I would just like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this idea? And also if you've know other funders who are not as involved with the sport for dev and kind of their perceptions on the sector and its potential for impact.
Very good question. Well, I think this guidebook can also very easily be used for funders to begin giving an understanding of how oriented sport for development is within the wider international development policy framework through these different initiatives that is being described in the guidebook. And I do think that in the funder space in wider international development, if we're looking not at government, not at international organizations, but as the question hints at, philanthropists, private foundations, corporate foundations. I think still that this is a huge sector that is largely ignored by sport development. We tend to go towards private companies to sponsor programs. We tend to move towards international organizations in our corporate proposal. But the large group of international funders, including all the big ones and many of us who have worked in international development would know, like the Ford Foundation and that type of organization. I don't think there is a lot of appreciation of the power and potential of sport within that sector. More tendency to look towards sports as a recreational activity and not necessarily a tool for social development. So I do think we need to find a way of reaching out and developing an understanding and appreciation of the role that sport can play in social development for this particular sector. Do we need a guidebook? Well, as I say, maybe we already have it, but possibly we would need to adapt it as well. So it can help these organizations, these foundations, these philanthropists to find themselves within a space that very much speaks to their own agenda, which in many, many cases are the sustainable development goals as well.
Thanks, Martin. I'll head over. These two questions are for Ben and Atsuko. Ben, so in the context of the guidebook, is it inclusive in terms of the disabled community? So either Ben or Atsuko, if you want to answer that. And then the second question is also, which is super interesting around this, the whole in theme of monitoring and evaluating. How will you monitor and evaluate the impact of the guidebook, or what are your plans for that? So there's two questions there.
Sure. Atsuko, do you want to, I know you're going to track the usage of the Japan Sport Council website. Do you want to talk about that quickly? And then I'll take the other question.
So regarding the follow-up of the utilization of this guidebook, yes, we are following on the numbers of the users, and not only the users, but we are also planning to have a follow-up surveys. If the participants of today's as well, that how they could utilize it on the field, and what kind of impact or outcomes we could generate through it. So in that sense, we are trying to trace that outcomes. That's one question I could say right now.
Yeah, great. And we also, just to say, we welcome any feedback from all stakeholders using the guidebook. We recognize it's a great resource, but it's also nothing's perfect. And if there's any feedback on how we can improve the guidebook and how we can adapt it, and we encourage people to use it and adapt it to their context, but please do feel free to send any feedback over to Sport and Dev or to the Japan Sport Council directly on how we could improve the current offering. And as Atsuko said, we will distribute a survey. Good question in terms of disabled access. It's something we probably need to work on further. Currently the guidebook is available in e-version, but we'd also welcome thoughts on how we can make it more accessible for people with various forms of disability. And there is a theme of obviously ensuring sport is inclusive for persons with disability within the guidebook itself, but that is probably something we haven't considered enough in terms of the actual guidebook. So we again welcome feedback there, and we will, most likely after having done a survey and taken in feedback, there is a chance we will update the e-version of the guidebook and based on feedback from stakeholders. Just to touch on another question, and whether it's available in French, I think I said earlier it's available in English and Japanese. That's what we had resources for, but if resources are available, we'd be very open to providing the guidebook in other languages, recognizing there is a language divide in this sector. So I'll stop there.
And that actually, I was going to go to you, Talia, but I saw that you answered it in the chat. I think. Where would you like to see the sector of sport for development in 15 to 20 years?
Oh, yes. I wasn't sure if there'd be time. I'd just love to see it more integrated in a deliberate way as part of planning for emergencies, planning for education, mental health interventions, and for there to be more confidence maybe beyond the sport for development sector in how sport can be deliberately used instead of it being sort of an ad hoc or holdover in between or a diversion. You know, how can it be deliberately used towards these outcomes? And I hope it can happen sooner than 15 to 20 years. So maybe I'm not dreaming big enough, but there we go. Thank you.
Thanks. And now I'll hand it over to you, Ben.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. We're a little bit over time, and I know we probably didn't get to all of the questions, but if you feel we didn't get to your comment or question, feel free to email. You can email me directly or info@sportanddev.org, and we will try respond or direct one of your questions to one of the panelists or presenters that were here today. I'm sure they'd be willing to respond after the fact. We will share a recording of this webinar in due course with you all and for people who are unable to attend today. And hopefully the people who struggled with the sound today can listen to the recording. As a reminder, you can access the digital version on the Japan Sport Council website. It's open access, freely available resource. We encourage you to use it, to adapt it and share it widely with your networks. And again, very open to feedback on how we can improve this resource moving forward. So just before we close, I'd really just like to thank all our speakers for taking the time to join us today from across the world, across different time zones, contexts, cultures, and continents. I would like to thank the Japan Sport Council for their continued support of this project, for funding the development of this guidebook, and to the team at Sport and Dev for organizing this webinar. I'd also like to thank all the stakeholders that contributed. This includes the advisory committee members, the reviewers, the people who trialed the guidebook, and many of are here today, and all who provided useful feedback. It's really, really much appreciated. And it really was a team effort over a long period of time. So just before we close off, we'd like to take a group photo. So if you're comfortable with it, please switch on your video very quickly. My colleague Marissa will take a group photo. So thank you so much again for joining us today. And we appreciate everyone making the time, making the effort. We hope it's been a valuable session, and we look forward to being in contact with you further around the guidebook, your usage of the guidebook, and any thoughts and recommendations you have there. So thank you once again. If you could just switch on your video, we'll take a photo and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you may be.
All right, so bear with me. All right, 1, 2, 3. One page. And I'll do one more. 1, 2, 3. And oh wow. So many people. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I got it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. And thanks for joining us today. And we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very great contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. We make good use of it.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thanks everybody. To the panelists and the presenters. I'm aware we didn't discuss whether we were going to stay on afterwards. I think I think we're aware everyone's got really busy schedules. I know Etsuko and Mr. Ashidate are in their evening in Japan, and some people are in their early morning. So I think feel free to leave everybody, but if anyone has any thoughts, feedback, or wants to debrief about the session, just drop an email to myself or Marissa. But thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. And happy to do a debrief call if need be at a later date. But thanks again for your time, and we'll let you go now.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Etsuko. Thanks very much, and great to see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.